What's going on? It's been a while. We are headed into the new year, the new school year. Um, I'll say I'm excited. I think Columbia, it gets kind of dead around here when the students aren't around as much as we like to complain about them when they are here. Um, they give this place energy, they give this place magic. This school year actually is going to be even more different for me. My son is going to be attending the University of South Carolina this year, so I'm going to be moving him in this weekend. But that's neither here nor there. I'm back in the office. When I'm back in the office, that means we have office hours. And when we have office hours, that really just means I get a chance to get on this mic and talk to y'all. So, as we tend to do around this time, I'm going to start, giving my 10-minute thesis on something that is on my mind as I've just been kind of binge watching a lot of television shows over the last couple of months. But I really wanted to talk to you today about The Shy, right? The Shy is this show that represents the city, my hometown, right? And it does representation of the landscapes, the soundscapes, and so on and so forth that, I guess should be reminiscent of the place that I grew up in, the place that I know and love. But I have some mixed opinions about it, right? So let's get into it. Now, when The Shy premiered, I'll be honest, I was very excited. I was very excited. Here was this television show created by Lena Waithe, who was this superstar, this juggernaut, someone from my hometown, or at least, seemingly from my hometown. Some people say she's from Evanston, but whatever. I think she's from out west, or and went to college in Chicago at Columbia College. So I mean, she's definitely from the area. She's definitely from my hometown, and it had this stated mission to highlight like the complexity, the resilience, and the beauty of Black life on the South Side of Chicago, not just the trauma as news feeds and as politicians and other folks have sort of peddled to us about the super predators and the gangbangers and just the sheer war zones that are in Chicago. But finally, it seemed like someone was giving our city a lens that wasn't obsessed with these crime stats or these sensational headlines. One of my favorite rappers, Common, was on board as an executive producer. There was a slew of local actors, writers, and creatives who were brought into this process. I thought we were witnessing the beginning of something like what The Wire was for Baltimore. Only this time it would be something showcasing Chicago, right? And in those early seasons, you can kind of feel a commitment to that authenticity. You see the actual South Side neighborhoods and those landscapes, real blocks, real corner stores, murals, historic landmarks, you know, historic um historic visions of sort of the ways in which Chicago has sort of rose to prominence as one of our premier cities. For instance, one of the main characters in the show, played by Jacob Lattimore, is named Emmett. Emmett being a nod to historical figure Emmett Till, the young man who lost his life down in Mississippi for whistling at a white woman, right? And so that's just one example. But most importantly, you saw it in the cadence of the city, the accents, the vernacular, and you saw it in the storytelling. The show centered around young people and adults that were desperately trying to guide them and raise them uh, against the systems that were designed to fail them. And there was this nuanced portrayal of Chicago's class tensions, which aren't just interracial, but intraracial. And it talks about how proximity doesn't always mean connection between the elite Black neighborhoods of Chicago and the more economically disenfranchised ones. They weaved in our local political corruption, the way that the churches operate, the musical scenes in Chicago, the neighborhood histories, and they did this in ways that felt intentional, grounded, and very well researched. But now, several seasons in, we've seen this show transition through the Paramount system, and Showtime and Paramount. I'm grappling with something that feels like somewhat of a slow erosion. The show that at one point felt like an ode to the city is starting to feel more like a soap opera that is just vaguely set in Chicago. And there's been this noticeable pivot away from the city um, as a character, and then there's this move towards more sensational drama amongst the characters. And that's not to say the stakes aren't still real. There's gun violence, there's trauma, there's betrayal. It's all there, but the frequency and the intensity of it has become to feel less like commentary and more like television formula. I'll be honest. Since Jason Mitchell's departure from the show, I feel like the continuity of the show was thrown off and that the tone of the show has changed. And that's not to say that Jason Mitchell was the anchor to this show and that it couldn't live on without him, but I feel like his story arc was very much a part of that show's early heartbeat. And the current version leans heavy on spectacle. Almost every major character has either been shot at or has shot someone or has been shot and killed. The emotional arcs, while they give this weight of melodrama, they sometimes feel flat to me. There's an increasing reliance on like sex scenes and dramatic pregnancy reveals, which are starting to feel less like reflections of Black life, but more network notes about what sells, but then also what can possibly lend towards viral content on platforms like TikTok or Instagram or get reactions on X, formerly known as Twitter. That said, I understand that this is a business. Media is an industry. Television is expensive. Renewal depends on ratings. I cannot fault Lena or the team that is behind this show doing what's necessary to keep the show alive. But I do worry that the shy sometimes risks perpetuating some of the very images that it sought to resist. And if the city becomes a backdrop for Black pain and scandal rather than a fully formed community with depth and joy, I guess what I thought would make the show special has begun at times to disappear. And don't get me wrong, I'm still rooting for it, partially because I'm from Chicago, but partially to be transparent, I know folks who work on this show. Christina Ray Colon is someone. Christina Ray Colon is someone who, I won't say is my bestie, but is someone who is in my inner circle to an extent, and I love her creativity as a writer, and I'm so happy that she's gotten the opportunity to write on a show that is very prominent and has been successful. And then I think about someone like Vic Mensa, who I have seen since a young person, you know what I'm saying, when he was coming up in the rap game, and I was helping to sort of guide and mentor him a little bit. And he's sort of grown into this juggernaut of a musician, but then also just a sheer force of nature as it pertains to his work in the community. And now as an actor, he's doing his thing, right? And I'm happy to see him on camera every week, right? And for that reason, I watch the show and I see the work is created for local talent. I see the platform it's given to Black owned businesses, specifically fashion designers. I've seen the shine it's brought to our emerging musicians and how it's sort of spread the way that we talk and how we kind of maneuver through the world, our slang. I appreciate how it's even wrestled with the contradictions in the Black church that exists within specifically Chicago. And that's a subplot that's often avoided in our mainstream portrayals. And there are some other bright spots. Jason Weaver is doing powerful work. Lynn Whitfield, Kadeem Hardison, they have this, veteran thespian energy that elevates the material. The growth arcs of the young core characters who've practically grown up on screen, those carry weight. Those have been interesting to sort of follow. They're diverging paths that move towards entrepreneurship or street life or redemption. These things remain some of the most honest portrayals of what it means to come of age on the south side of Chicago. But last night I rewatched the pilot, and I'll say that first episode, it still hits. It reminded me that the Shy once held this potential that I saw as it being, comparable to The Wire. But what I watched this very last season feels more like a Chicago version of like an Oprah Winfrey or Tyler Perry type drama. And that's not a dig. Those shows have an audience, but it's a very different type of storytelling, one that's more rooted in a type of sensationalism than sociology. more humor than seriousness, uh, more shine um, than character. And so, where does that leave me? I think the show for me is somewhat at a crossroads, even though it keeps getting renewed. Right? I don't think it should be canceled. I don't think it will be canceled anytime soon. That's not where I'm at. I just know that so many people are having eyes on this show. It's opened doors. It's employed a lot of folks. But with that said, it should still evolve. I believe it needs to somewhat return to its original DNA and decide the story that it wants to tell with a little bit more continuity, given all of the things that have happened over the course of the last, I want to say, 8 seasons. And as certain characters are now leaving the show's storyline, right? I think that there's an opportunity to sort of bring it back together and be a mirror for Chicago's Black communities, uh, write this love letter for our triumphs, our contradictions, our layered identities. But I feel like the writing still has to somewhat match that ambition. I recently watched an interview with Jason Weaver where he revealed that he was originally supposed to play Ronnie, a character that will end up being played by another actor, and Showtime pushed back. Lena promised to circle back to him when the time was right, and she did, right? And that anecdote to me says a lot. It speaks to how much trust creators of color have to build with networks before they can fully cast and script their vision. Sometimes what we see on screen isn't even what the creator originally intended. And to be honest, that reality softens some of my criticism because I know how hard it is to get a show like The Shy on the air in the first place, let alone get it renewed for what is this, 8 seasons. And so, as someone deeply invested in how our city is represented, I stay somewhat protective. There's a reason that people think of Chicago in very narrow terms. Our image has been exported through very limited lenses, whether it be drill music, whether it be, crime statistics, or even if we just think about it from the standpoint of athletes and playing basketball, the city that Michael Jordan brought into national prominence. The Shy had an opportunity to sort of widen that lens, and I think it still can. But to do so, it has to remember that our stories aren't just dramatic. I think there's a need to get back to the beauty, the spiritual, the joyful, sometimes mundane, messy, and deeply human aspects of living on the south side of Chicago. And so I just believe as this show keeps going, um, I'm hoping that it returns to its roots, not just in geography, but in purpose, and show the world that being from Chicago isn't necessarily just about surviving trauma, but about building, dreaming, and loving, sometimes all at once. But no matter what, if you're gonna call the show The Shy, it's always gonna, to me, be feeling like home. And so that's the one thing I took away, but I also wanted to put my critique out there. Thank you. And that is my 10-minute thesis.